1, 2, 3, 4. Es gewinnt eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich hab gearbeitet wie ein Hund. Es gewinnt eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich darf schon schlafen, ganz gesund. Ich komme heim zu dir, das was du tust von mir. You know I feel alright. Du weißt, ich arbeite alle Tag. Sie machen Geld, sie kauft die Tschatschkes. Sie sagen mir Chaie, wenn ich her. Du bist mein Ein und einzige Zatschke. Ich komme heim zu dir, das was du tust von mir. You know I feel alright. In der Heim, als Dings ist so fein. In der Heim, lebe dich freilich sein. Es gibt eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich hab gearbeitet wie ein Hund. Es gibt eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich darf schon schlafen, ganz gesund. Ich komme heim zu dir.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Nirmala Rao, and I'm Vice Principal here at the school, and it's my pleasure to preside over this evening's event, the inaugural lecture by Professor Colin Shindler. Before going any further, I'd like to offer my special thanks to the klezmer band from Jewish Music Institute. I just want to say something about the band, because we were going to put up a slide, and it became slightly difficult, so I'm going to say a couple of things about the band. It's an ongoing project run by Francesca Terberg of the Jewish Music Institute, which is based on campus at SOAS. Musicians at SOAS and from the public wishing to learn and perform celebratory and soulful melodies emanating from 500 years of Eastern European Jewish music are welcome to join us and to understand more about the history and background of this vibrant and unique tradition. Going back to the inaugural lecture by Professor Colin Shindler, this pleasant duty of presiding normally falls to our director, Professor Paul Webley, and he has asked me to apologize for not being here tonight. Along with the Dean of the Faculty of Languages and Cultures, Professor Michael Hutt, Paul's attending a ceremony at St. James's Palace to receive on behalf of the school the Queen's Anniversary Prize awarded for our language teaching. In fact, it has just been announced, actually just some 10 minutes ago. So we must excuse his absence. I know that he and our dean wanted very much to be here to introduce Professor Colin Shindler, who is professor in that same faculty, as many of you will know. They may be able to join us later on, they say, but in the meantime, I'd like to take this opportunity to congratulate the faculty for their fantastic achievement. In a moment, I shall hand you over to Professor Ilan Truan, who will introduce Professor Schindler's lecture with an appreciation of his scholarly achievements to date. At the end of the lecture, Professor Tudor Parfit will offer us his reflections on what we've heard here tonight. Professor Tudor Parfit is Professor of Modern Jewish Studies here at SOAS. He has a long association with Israel, where he has been a fellow of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and wrote his doctorate on the history of the Jews in Palestine. Professor Parfit joined SOAS as a lecturer in modern Hebrew in 1974. Before introducing Professor Truan to you, I should like first to offer some background on Professor Shindler, a very brief background, because I'll leave Professor Truan to tell you more about his achievements. Colin Shindler is a true polymath who began his career in chemistry with an MSc in inorganic macromolecules and who managed a twin-track progression with a doctoral thesis on the history of Israel's Likud Party. During this period, Colin Shindler played an active role in the campaign to secure the right of Soviet Jews to emigrate, and for some years ran an information service in support of that campaign, which was also the subject of his first book, published in 1978. His commitment to research and writing the history of Israel eventually took over, and he became a full-time scholar and historian with a further 7 books to his name and a formidable stream of published papers and lectures. Colin Shindler was already a mature scholar when he arrived at SOAS as a postdoctoral fellow in 1998. A highly productive period led to his tenured teaching appointment in 2005, from which he progressed rapidly to a professorship of Israeli studies just last year. This is the first such chair in this country. Colin Shindler's has been a unique career trajectory. Whereas most of us labor in the growth of the academy from a young age, gradually building our contribution, Colin took SOAS by storm with his massive contribution to the history of Israel and of Zionism in a very short period. During that time, he also established a Center for Jewish Studies, which he continues to chair. Tonight, we mark the formal recognition of Colin Shindler's academic standing and achievements with his inaugural lecture entitled The Road to Utopia, The Origins of Anti-Zionism on the British Left. He'll be introduced by Professor Ilan Truan, as I said, another eminent scholar of political Judaism. Professor Truan has held the chair of Israeli Studies at Brandeis University since its foundation in 2002 and directs the Schusterman Center for Israeli Studies since 2006. Ilan Truan grew up in the Boston area but moved to Israel as a young man, he tells me, and made his scholarly career there. He rose to become Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Ben-Gurion University, where he also served as director of the Ben-Gurion Research Institute and Archives. We have then one very eminent scholar in Israeli studies here tonight to introduce another. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Professor Ilan Truan.
Thank you very much. I'm here to bring greetings to Professor Shindler and to SOAS on this remarkable and wonderful occasion. And I bring greetings from my colleagues around the world who engage in Israel studies, from Shanghai and Beijing to Melbourne to Buenos Aires to Azerbaijan to all kinds of locales who are all of us anew, although not all of us began as chemists. All of us are really new to this area, and there's a whole generation of several hundred of us who have come to try to bring this topic to the universities. I should say at the beginning that many of us have been observing with great care what Professor Shindler has been placed on the web, all the extraordinary, wonderful activities that are going on at this institution. And some of us, like myself, were hoping actually to be invited to SOAS, although I personally thought that if I would ever be invited, I could talk about myself rather than Professor Shindler. Nevertheless, speaking about Professor Shindler is a pleasure. However, this event must be recognized for what it also is. It's an indication of academic leadership of SOAS in placing under its rubric recognition and approval for an emerging field of scholarship which is surely and rapidly finding its way into the academy in so many universities across the world. There are multiple ways of thinking about Israel studies, and before I get exactly to Professor Shindler, I'd like to briefly sketch what they are because it's within those rubrics that one can understand what Professor Shindler has done and is likely to do. Israel studies can be located in Jewish studies, it can be located in Middle Eastern studies, it can be part of courses in contemporary history. Let me begin with the first. Zionism began as a call to return Jews to history. Take them out of the ghettos, make them members of society. And there were lots of tactics for doing this. There were religious strategies, there were secular strategies, but among the many strategies, the one that emerged most prominent and is the subject of our evening was Zionism, which attempted to bring Jews back into history by giving them sovereignty in a land which they had once come from. Thus, what Zionism tried to do and what Israel studies is about is looking at Jewish people living in their own land under the rubric of their own independence and redefining themselves as actors in the modern world. In short, the study of Israel is the study of a thriving culture, a thriving modern culture. One example or two examples give you the incidence of the place of Hebrew in the contemporary world. more than 8 million people actually speak the language, which is more than some European languages. In the Widener Library of Harvard University, which is one of the greatest libraries in the world, the eighth largest collection of books in any language is in Hebrew. And it may begin with the Bible, but it also reflects tens of thousands of tomes that were created in the 20th century by Hebrew Revived. One can give many examples of the revival of Jewish culture in its own country, in technology, even in warfare, alas, in theater, in books. In fact, more books per capita are produced in Israel probably than in any other society in the world. In terms of Jewish history, then, the study of Israel is a topic worth understanding, worth investigating, and it is a new topic. When the State of Israel was created, the number of Jews in the world who were actually in Palestine was, often before my classes I will say, anybody who give me the right answer gets a free trip anywhere. And the answer is about 6%. Only 6% of the Jews of the world were living in Israel in 1946, probably about the same number of Jews who were living in Great Britain. In short, Jews in Palestine emerged over the last 60 years to become the largest and potentially the largest center of Jewish history in the long course of Jewish history, and it is likely to match or perhaps surpass the collection of Jews who live broadly in the Anglo-Saxon diaspora. The study of Jewish history then, of placing Israel in Jewish history then, is certainly one of the rubrics. But yet, of course, there is another one. And that other one is the conflict. But before we get to the conflict, or I get to the conflict, I will suggest to you that there's another rubric which Jews in particular tend not to think about. And those who oppose or stand against the State of Israel also tend not to think about. Most of the people who study Israel are not Jews. I'll say that again. Most of the people who study Israel are not Jews. And I'm going to give you some examples of it. And the examples come from a doctoral dissertation that a student of mine is engaged in. It's a study of tourism and pilgrimages to Palestine and then Israel since the mid-19th century. And what he writes about is that when Protestants come to Palestine, they tend not to go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, they go to Gethsemane. On the other hand, Catholics don't go to Gethsemane, they go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that there's a different Jerusalem if you happen to be Armenian, Copt, Lutheran, or what have you. Not only that, there are Jews who tend to go to Kfar Chabad to see the present the imitation of the house of their Rebbe in that particular community. Jews from Northern Africa will tend to go to Sderot or to Tzfat to see places which are associated with the saints they left behind in Northern Africa. One could go on and on and on with this. What I'm trying to suggest is that Israel is not one place. It is a place that exists in multiple imaginations and multiple cultures, and that almost everybody who tends to look at Israel looks at it through the filter of his own personal cultural experience. In short, there's a kind of topography of what Israel comprehends, and it's reflected in the names. Is it Palestine or Israel? Is it Israel or the land of Israel? Is it the West Bank or Judea and Samaria? Is it El-Quds or Jerusalem? Is it El-Khalil or Hebron? The names of the streets are contentious. There's an enormous diversity of mental, physical, and cultural maps, and in such a small country. This intensity justifies serious study in a university and from a multiplicity of perspectives. In the United States, Catholic institutions are adopting Israel studies. Israel is no longer, or Jews are no longer, the little brother. Mormons, Protestants, all manners of other people are introducing Israel studies because of their own particular perspectives on it. And that seems to me to be appropriate for SOAS. SOAS, I also read on the web something about SOAS. This is my first time here. And insofar as webs are accurate, and it wasn't Wikipedia, so I have confidence, it says that SOAS is, what does it say about SOAS? SOAS is for the study of a highly diverse range of subjects concerned with Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. SOAS is a remarkable institution, we're told, uniquely combining language scholarship, disciplinary expertise, and regional focus. The point is that Israel, until this occasion, and Professor Schindler's appointment, has very rarely, anywhere in the world, been studied in the context of Middle Eastern history or Middle Eastern studies, except as a party to the Arab-Israeli conflict. But inasmuch as SOAS is a center for the study of all manner of civilizations outside the European orbit in particular, then isn't it interesting that Jews can be included in that? For I can testify that as an Israeli as well, is that I live in a Levantine country. My language is non-European, it's Hebrew, Arabic, and that there are many aspects of my culture which are absolutely non-Western. In short, in all those rubrics and categories, the study of Israel fits within the mandate of what SOAS ought to do, and how wonderful that SOAS broke the barrier and brought in Israel within the context of Middle Eastern studies. There is the significance of this, then, is that Jews who have generally been associated with that part of the world 2,000 years ago can now again, in this non-political but academic way, be associated with it again in terms of the kind of scholarship that contemporary society should privilege and justify. Well, if Israel studies are to be part of SOAS, how to teach it? And you don't have anybody better than Colin Shindler. He is really a name and a byword throughout where all my colleagues go. I'm very active in the International Associations for Israel Studies. That SOAS is on the map, and indeed I would even go further, that Israeli scholarship in Britain is on the map because of what Colin Shindler has achieved here in a relatively short period of time. So then, how does one teach Israel? And here I would turn to an analysis of what it is that Colin Shindler has done. His work, by and large, his scholarship, the book published in the mid-1990s and republished recently as Land Beyond Promise, Israel, Likud, and the Zionist Dream, is a study of the Zionist right. Now, the Zionist right is a new topic, and why it is a new topic is clear. Because Zionist historiography, or Jewish historiography, privileged the left. After all, Ben-Gurion was for 15 years, was head of the Jewish Agency, 15 years head of the Sochnut, of the Hebrew Histadrut before it, the labor union, and 15 years the prime minister and defense minister of Israel. He has his fingers over all the public documents. Therefore, one has to study him and his party. There are institutes, probably more historical institutes in Israel for individuals than any other society that I know of. There are institutes for Peres, for Golda, for Rabin, and one could go on and on and on. It's not just individuals who are moralized in institutes, but it's also associations. For example, the Histadrut has its own archives and its own institutes. And my favorite example, and perhaps it tells the whole story, is the kibbutz. The kibbutz movement has been sanctified, recorded, propagated in a whole plethora of institutes. Indeed, a colleague of mine once counted the amount of published articles written in the kibbutz, and it comes to more than 3,000. You maybe have a dozen or two on Tel Aviv. Colin Shindler, by the way, in one of his great and remarkable events, celebrated the centenary of Tel Aviv. We know less about Tel Aviv, which traditionally has housed a third of the yishuv, of the Jewish settlement of Palestine, since the 1930s, than we do about a whole variety of very minor kibbutzim. So there's much revolutionary work that can be done in that sensitivity to looking for the extraordinary. Thinking non-linearly is part of what he has achieved. To begin studying the right in the 1980s was to really enter into territory that might be called virgin territory. To be sure, there were several scholars who had looked at it, but never with the kind of weight and intensity which Colin Shindler examined it, and he came to it with an interesting and an important question. If you were writing a grown-up, and maybe it was an advantage getting a degree in chemistry rather than Jewish history, because had he gotten a degree in Jewish history, he would have been guided to a whole variety of other traditional topics. But coming from wherever he came, in his own imagination, whatever his political sensibilities might be, whatever his curiosities, he chose to study the origins, the development of the group that had come to control Israel. Israelis were unprepared in 1977 when Begin took power. They yet had no explanation for the origins, the nature, the dynamism, the peculiarities, the importance, the significance, the hopes of the movement that has increasingly become the dominant or predominant movement within Israeli politics. Who are they? Where did they come from? What do they think? The dominant view was the they is they. They are homogeneous. It's an it. Thanks to Colin Shindler, we learned a great deal that the they is really complicated. There may be not as many, but there are certainly many schisms within the right, even as there are on the left. And to take us through the history of those schisms, why they happened, that Menachem Begin may claim to be a student of Jabotinsky, the reality is that he revolted against Jabotinsky, and that there are other people who revolted against Begin. It's a complicated, wonderful story, and unless you understand how that happened, and that there are echoes of that kind of internal conflict, even today in Israeli politics, you cannot understand Israeli politics today. So that is a major contribution. My favorite review of it, I published in the journal Israel Studies by Aryeh Naor, who is the son of one of the founders of the Likud, who was a major student of it. He was the secretary of Begin's cabinet. In short, a person of politics and a person of the academy claimed, and as a student also of the Likud, that no one can study the Likud, the right, in Israeli politics and in Israeli history today without dealing with and without learning from Colin Shindler. In a sense, what has become central to Israel is now found in the centrality of Colin Shindler's scholarship. There's a second book, and I won't belabor this more than necessary, I think. It's necessary to talk about his most recent book, which is A History of Modern Israel. And it is a book which I think is being adopted throughout the world by my colleagues and myself as we teach courses on Israeli society, history, culture. And what we find in it, I think, reflects what it is that he must have done at SOAS. That is to say, this book is not a polemic. It is a balanced piece of scholarship that maybe it is informed, my guess, is that it's informed by a scholar who came to scholarship in a nonlinear way, which to say he chose to talk about the right when the right was still unpopular. And he uses the history of the right and of politics as the spine about which to interpret much of Israeli history, but he doesn't write a history of the right. He includes them all. Ben-Gurion, Sharet, Dayan, they're all there. All these actors are there, but not as biographies, not in the Carlylean sense that these are individuals who are to be admired and imitated, but rather using through the lives of individuals, their hopes, their aspirations, their ambitions, their conflicts, a way of telling and retelling in a new way the history of Israel. What I find so remarkable about the book is that there is a unique sense of balance. He will begin, for example, quoting David Grossman's pained, it's almost eulogy over the death of his son in the war in Lebanon and talking about all that's wrong with Israel. Very quickly, then, the author will take us to tell you, well, that's but part of the story. He will tell you that Israel has an excessive role for its generals, but then he'll tell you that there was never a putsch. He'll tell you that Israel is one of the most successful economic societies in the world. On the other hand, there's an enormous gap between rich and poor. He will tell his readers that there was a war of independence, but will also explain why Palestinians understand and feel so deeply about the Nakba. He will explain why there's the failure to achieve a peace process, but he won't lay the blame at any one side. What Colin Shindler does is teach complexity. That's an enormous achievement in a field where there's almost nobody who comes into a classroom without a preconception about the rights and the wrongs, who doesn't think with moral passion, having never read a word or a text in actuality. Thinking in complexity is one thing, to translate it to others through books and through the classroom is something else. From everything I've read here, the Colin Shindler at SOAS, a place not traditionally known as a pro-Zionist bastion, and to teach it successfully, where Palestinians and other Muslims and Christians and Jews can come together and feel satisfied that they've learned something about themselves and what they have to say has been respected, but also to learn something about the other in a welcoming way is an achievement of the first order. I think that SOAS is very lucky to have Colin Shindler. I think all of us are very lucky to have Colin Shindler. We hope that he continues to write at the same pace that he has, which is an extraordinary number of books in but a short period of time. I certainly haven't managed to keep that up, and very few have. But I would also like to congratulate him on not only for the present, but for the future. I think there's something to the story of an individual who begins as a chemist and becomes a historian of Zionism. And you know what the early examples are. Chaim Weizmann was a chemist. And then he wrote this book, which isn't really history, called Trial and Error, but changed his career. There's another chemist, probably more important than even Chaim Weizmann, and that's Theodor Herzl's chemist, David Litvak, who together with Rashid Bey are the two heroes of Alt-Neuland, one a Jew, the other a Palestinian. Both of them are chemical engineers. It isn't exactly being a chemistry professor, but it is chemistry. And when the Hebrew University was found, its first faculties included a faculty of chemistry. Chemistry has a long and a distinguished career in the history of Zionist thought, and maybe it's appropriate that finally we actually have a good academic historian who practices it. My point is, though, that to move from chemistry to academic scholarship is nonlinear. It is unexpected. There's nothing that anybody on the outside would have thought would have prepared that individual to achieve what he has achieved. I rather like that. I think that professors who themselves are nonlinear in their careers are capable of teasing out of their students unconventional and original thought. And I think that what we're in to experience and see with Professor Schindler's tenure as this chair of Israel Studies at SOAS is a deepening and of that tradition of originality and devotion to his subject. So from all of us who live abroad, I would wish Professor Shindler much success, and I would congratulate him and SOAS on his being the first professor of Israel Studies. I must explain, being an uncouth American, I did not know what the protocol was. I should have introduced Professor Shindler and asked him to come forward. I shall do so now. Professor Shindler, will you come forward?
Thank you all for coming. It's amazing. It's a bit like Woodstock, this. I can't think of any other analogy. Before I start, I want to say a few quick thank yous. First of all, to my wife, Jean. This is her inaugural as much as it is mine tonight. To the magnificent Katie Nugent, to Rebecca Song, to Johanna Flaherty, to Fiona McWilliams, and to everyone who's really worked hard to put this together tonight, thank you. To my colleagues in Jewish studies and in Hebrew, Tudor, Tamar, Catherine, Shmuel, thank you for working together in all our joint endeavours in Jewish studies. To Nirmala, thank you for the kind words. And to Ilan, thank you indeed also for your kind words and for crossing several ponds to be here, and for your leadership in being a pioneer in Israel studies around the world. To Trevor, to Charles, to Zoe of the Pears Foundation for your enthusiasm and your commitment to Israel studies. And to Paul Webley, who's just walked in, always his support for Jewish studies at SOAS, and personally his fairness in difficult times. As Nirmala and Ilan pointed out, my history is being revealed to you as a chemist. I'm pleased no one referred to Mrs. Thatcher as a chemist. A few years ago, I was more at home with the higher oxidation states of the first transition metal series and the works of Vladimir Jabotinsky. So I'd like to thank SOAS as an institution for giving me the chance. This has been a long road for me. My late parents would have been both bemused and bewildered at tonight's events. My father was a gents tailor who worked hard all his life in a factory. My mother was a very good buttonholer. And it's to their memory that I dedicate tonight's lecture. Right, it's working, wonderful. Since the end of the peace process in the 1990s and the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, an important feature in the debate on the Israel-Palestine imbroglio has been a questioning of the legitimacy of Israel as a nation-state by sections of the political left and the liberal and cultural intelligentsia in Britain. Such opinion has broadly moved from passionately supporting the right of the Jews to national self-determination in 1948 by figures such as Anir Bevan, Bertrand Russell, and Tony Benn, to questioning that right over 60 years later. Israel is often seen as troublesome on a good day and illegitimate on a bad one. Like many Israelis, many on the left wish to roll back the borders to the 1967 boundaries. But there is also a growing number who wish to continue that process and return to 1948. There is a deepening identification with the Palestinians as the underdog and their depiction as a colonized people. And this strikes a chord deep in the British psyche. The remorse felt after a legacy of slavery, imperial repression, and colonial exploitation is real. However, there is a growing belief that this rollback applies today, not simply to the settlements on the West Bank, but also to Israel as well. No distinction is made between colonialism and colonization. Yet this disillusionment with Israel, I would argue, began before 1967, before the conquest of the Six-Day War, and before the settlement drive on the West Bank. There is greater identification today with the new left of the decolonization era of the 1960s than with the old left of the post-fascist era after 1945. Whereas the old left had fought Mosley's British Union of Fascists in the East End with the Jews, lived through the Holocaust and the rise of Israel, the new left came of age during the epoch of decolonization. It was shaped more by Che Guevara's studies in Latin America and the fight against apartheid and opposition to the Vietnam War. While Jews disproportionately participated in those struggles, the Shoah and the rise of Israel was for many Jews not simply another historical event. Even for those born long after the war, it was understood that all Jews are survivors. This level of consciousness separates the Jewish left from the broader British left. In 2009, the existence of a state with a Jewish majority in the Middle East does not easily fit Marxist doctrine, post-colonial theory, and Islamist belief. As Benedict Anderson remarked in Imagined Communities, nationalism is a real problem for Marxists. rather, quote, elided rather than confronted. It is this inability to define Zionism and to classify the Jews which has brought together liberals and social democrats, the Trotskyists of the Socialist Workers' Party, the Stalinists of the Communist Party of Britain, and the Islamists of the Muslim Brotherhood front organizations. Together they reaffirm Clément Tonnerre's contention in the French Constituency Assembly in 1789. Everything must be refused to the Jews as a nation. Everything must be granted to them as individuals. Max Nordau understood this well when he remarked at the First Zionist Congress in 1897 that the great men of the French Revolution emancipated the Jews, not through a fraternal feeling for the Jews, but because logic demanded it. There was a difference between theory and practice. It was this realization that propelled Jews in Eastern Europe to the understanding that the forces of revolutionary change were in general unable to emancipate the Jews in real terms. But only through a process of auto-emancipation could this be done. This spawned numerous ideologies promoting Jewish nationalism. Yet this idea of national assertiveness impinged negatively on the idea that heaven could be created right here on earth. It was not that Jews did not believe in social change, or indeed in revolution. It was that they believed that the theory of emancipation did not reflect their own reality. Many regarded themselves as a nation with a culture, a literature, a history, a plethora of languages, and a religion. A majority did not believe in assimilation and conversion. They did not wish to disappear to appease theory. Moses Hess's approach to socialism seemed to reflect this. Hess renounced Marx's belief that the actions of mankind could be placed in a scientific framework. As Isaiah Berlin commented, quote, Hess believed that social equality was desirable because it was just, not because it was inevitable. Nor was justice to be identified with whatever was bound, in any case, to emerge from the womb of time. All kinds of bad and irrational conditions had been produced before now and persisted. Nothing was to be accepted merely because it had occurred, but solely because it was objectively good. Much of current progressive thinking can be traced back to the success of the October Revolution of 1917. Lenin, of course, would have no truck with Jewish nationalism and was careful to airbrush out of existence any mention of his Jewish antecedent, Moshko Blank. In 1903, in a dispute with the Bund, he labeled the idea of a separate Jewish people as, quote, utterly untenable scientifically and reactionary in its political implication. In Lenin's eyes, it would divert Jewish workers from the primary task of class struggle. He recommended the choice of assimilation for the Jewish future. Yet 10 years later, Lenin recognized in part the national character of the Jews in his critical remarks on the national question. Fred Halliday has pointed out that Lenin had quite clearly shifted his position. In 1903, assimilation was the solution. By 1913, the Jews were depicted as a nationality. The Jews, according to Lenin, had skipped the national stage in their historical development. The Jews, therefore, became the pioneers of socialism and moved directly onto assimilation. The dichotomy was that, on the one hand, the Jews were a national minority in the transitional process of assimilating, who deserved protection against anti-Semitism. On the other, they had to be denied the right to national recognition. Moreover, Lenin's occasional writings on the Jews were written during periods when the question of Jewish nationality was related to larger issues confronting the Russian workers' movement. Significantly, the great majority of his writings on the Jews were written in the 2 years, 1903 and 1913. Lenin quoted Karl Kautsky's earlier works in 1903, which were predicated on the pioneers of the first Aliyah and Baron de Rothschild's munificence, and not on the Marxist Zionism of figures such as Ben-Gurion, Ben-Zvi, and Tabenkin of the second Aliyah. Lenin's analysis of Zionism was selective, partial, and outdated. Kautsky, unlike Lenin, analyzed Zionism and the Jewish settlement after World War I. Lenin never produced a general analysis of the Jewish question and never discussed the question of the socialist Zionist experiment in Palestine. His works were targeted on the wider issue of the national question in Russia. Lenin clearly knew little about Jews, Jewishness, and the travails of Jewish history. Most of the Jews with whom he was acquainted in the revolutionary movement were assimilated, acculturated, and Russified. Their Jewishness was often defined by transcending Jewishness. Unlike Nordau, Lenin believed that the emancipation of the Jews was by and large successful. In his writings, Lenin was therefore careful to quote Jews such as Alfred Nacquet, whose Jewishness was peripheral to his existence. Zionism, Lenin believed, derived its authority from the Jewish bourgeoisie and from Judaism. He did not understand that it was in part a rebellion against rabbinical authority and acquiescent Jewish leadership. The Jews, he believed, had only survived due to the scourge of anti-Semitism. The workers' movement, he argued, in capitalist Europe would defend the Jews against anti-Semitism. He also believed that after a socialist revolution, workers' states would automatically eradicate all forms of national prejudice, including anti-Semitism. As history has cruelly demonstrated, on both counts, Lenin was wrong. Leninist theory did not reflect the reality in which the Jews found themselves. Like Lenin, Stalin advocated the progressive assimilation of individual nationalities as part and parcel of, quote, the general process of development of nations. He too formally condemned anti-Semitism. Yet, as Simon Sebag Montefiore has recently demonstrated, he possessed a history of anti-Semitic outbursts going back to 1905. The Jews did not fit any theoretical framework. For Stalin, they were no more than a paper nation. What about this country? Although the UK was deeply welcoming to the Jews, following their readmission during Cromwell's English Republic, the anti-Semitic stereotype, contrary to conventional belief, was no stranger to the founding fathers of the great English socialist tradition. Lenin was a great admirer of J.A. Hobson, the well-known liberal economist. Hobson argued that the Boer War had been instigated by international Jewish bankers and East End Jews made good, such as Barney Bonato. Hobson associated imperialism with Jewish conspiracy and Victorian capitalism. He believed that Jews hiding behind English names were the true manipulators of the Boer War. Hobson's articles convinced figures such as Keir Hardie to find scapegoats in Jewish financiers. The non-Jewish Cecil Rhodes became Rhodestein. The revered founder of the Social Democratic Federation, H.M. Heinemann, held Jewish capitalists responsible for the Vienna riots of 1885 and the Panama Canal scandal of 1892, which implicated many French politicians. Heinemann grafted the cutting of anti-imperialism onto the tree of anti-Semitism. He spoke of, quote, an imperialist Judaism in Africa and the formation of, quote, an Anglo-Hebraic empire in the continent. Significantly, the civilizations of the Zulus, Basutus, and Matabele were spoken of in glowing terms, while the Jews were all merely greedy capitalists. The Jews were implicitly accused of the corruption of the innocent, a desecration of an unblemished utopia. The impoverished Jewish masses of Eastern Europe were invisible. This cocktail of the conspiratorial nature of Jewish capitalism, its construction of a Jewish imperialism designed to exploit, the legacy of left-wing anti-Semitism, the rise of Jewish nationalism, and the inability of both Marxists and liberals to explain the existence of the Jews according to the reality in which the Jews found themselves, all this contributed to the mindset of the British left following the October Revolution in 1917. This imagery was further embellished by Jews who wished to demonstrate that their prime allegiance was to the cause of the revolution. The October Revolution and the Balfour Declaration, which offered the Jews a national home within Palestine, in late 1917, occurred within days of each other. One offered Jews the possibility of repairing the world, of eradicating all injustice, of building Jerusalem in Moscow. Imagine all the people living life in peace. The other path offered a Jewish national entity in Palestine, something perfect, something unique, where the Jews would forge their own destiny. The former appealed to the universalist, indeed messianic tendencies within Judaism, while the latter appealed to particularism and a national self-interest. Many Jews fervently embraced the possibilities of destroying the old and building the new in Russia. They could escape anti-Semitism and the burden of Jewishness in an unsympathetic world. And many of those who worked for world revolution were former socialist Zionists who now looked upon the Zionist experiment as distant and utopian compared to the here and now of the success of the Bolsheviks. While there was a disproportionate number of assimilated Jews in the upper echelons of the Bolshevik party, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sverdlov, the Jewish masses, while welcoming the overthrow of autocracy and a workers' state, initially did not support the party in any great measure. This soon faded away. The passion with which multitudes of Jews entered the portals of Bolshevism was characterized in unusual ways. Celebrating Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year in October, was replaced by commemorating the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, also in October. The traditional chalot, the 2 loaves of bread to welcome in the Jewish Sabbath, was still displayed in Jewish Bolshevik homes, except that the chalot were now in the shape of a hammer and sickle. Shmuel Agursky, who was an émigré trade unionist who was living in London's East End, welcomed the revolution with messianic fervour. He, like other Jews, bestowed this belief on his son. His son was Michal Agursky, Professor Michal Agursky, who was a refusenik, was a dissident and a refusenik in the 1960s and 1970s, except that Shmuel Agursky did not name his son Michael. He named him Melech. This was his original name. Why Melech? Well, it's obvious, is it not? Marx, Engels, Lenin, international communism. There was, incidentally, the wife of Professor Alexander Voronel, who was a refusenik in the 1970s. His wife was called Ninel, not Nina, Ninel. Why Ninel? Think backwards. The ideological contribution of the Jewish communists thus became a major factor in Bolshevik decision-making on Zionism. They were, for example, the central movers in the banning of the Hebrew language by Lunacharsky in 1919. On his appointment on the 18th of January 1918, the new Commissar for Jewish Affairs, Semyon Demenstein, formerly an adherent of the Lubavitcher Hasidim, immediately proclaimed his opposition to the Balfour Declaration. The Jewish section of the party began to play on the ignorance, suspicion and confusion about Zionism within the Bolshevik party. It argued that Zionism was one of the branches of the imperialist counter-revolution, that it was linked to the Entente and to white counter-revolutionaries. The Zionists, it was pointed out, were present at the Versailles Conference, where imperialism remade the world in its own image. The existence of Jabotinsky's Jewish Legion in the British Army, composed of Russian Jewish émigrés domiciled in London, was further proof. The Bolsheviks profoundly believed in world revolution, and its success was predicated on revolution in the industrialized countries of the West. Yet this socialist internationalism was balanced by an almost opposing aim of nationalism. The Bolshevik primary interest in late 1917, and for many years to come, was to stabilize the Soviet Union and to ensure that the new order survived. Extending the appeal of revolution beyond Russia's borders would therefore create domestic problems for the imperialists and divert political and military attention away from Russia. The Kremlin in particular wished to attack the colonial underbelly of imperialist nations, since countries such as Britain were dependent on raw materials from the developing world. Trotsky pointed out that the path to London and Paris lay through their colonies. Moreover, the conquest of Palestine by General Allenby in 1917 brought the British closer to Russia's frontiers. The desire of Britain and France to control the Middle East was epitomized by the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement of June 1916. The text was published in both Pravda and in Izvestia 2 weeks after the October Revolution. The propagation of perfidious Albion was designed to raise embarrassing questions for the British amongst its subject peoples. The Bolsheviks feared that the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire by the imperial powers would prove to be the precursor to the dismemberment of Russia. The British also had their national interests. They erroneously believed that the Balfour Declaration would influence the Jews in the Bolshevik party, such as Leon Trotsky. In particular, they wanted to disrupt any German-Russian rapprochement before the build-up of American troops on the Western Front. Significantly, Trotsky made his famous comment, "I am not a Jew, I am an internationalist," to the Chief Rabbi of Petrograd just a few days after the Balfour Declaration. The utilization of the Arab world's resentment at the British therefore assisted the early Bolshevik state in its war of survival. The desire to awaken Arab opposition was enhanced by the emergence of this growing body of Jewish communists. In Palestine, the magnetism of the Bolsheviks caused a schism on the Zionist left to establish the Mopsim, the Mifleget Poalim Socialistim, the Socialist Workers' Party, which dreamed that the Red Army would cross the Caucasus and create a Soviet Palestine. This represented the birth of a Jewish anti-Zionist left in Palestine. The Comintern and its Eastern Department in Moscow, however, did not view the building of socialism in Palestine in the same way as did the Jewish communists in Palestine. The Comintern, which contained a disproportionate number of Jews, some of whom were former Zionists, regarded the presence of Jews per se in Palestine, regardless of whether they were Zionists or not, as counterproductive in spreading the revolution to the east. The future, they believed, lay with Arab nationalism rather than with Marxist Jews in Palestine. Thus, in 1926, the coming to power of Ibn Saud and Wahhabi Islam in Saudi Arabia was welcomed by the Kremlin and seen as liberating and progressive. In 1924, the first Arab member of the Palestine Communist Party joined, followed by another 8 the year after. Although the PCP supported the demonstrations and municipal electoral campaigns of Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, there was in reality a critical lack of progress on Arabization. In order to attract nationalist support in the Arab world, the Comintern argued for an anti-colonial front. Zionism was projected as reactionary, counter-revolutionary, and in league with British imperialism. The Sixth Congress of the Comintern in 1928 easily accepted Stalin's new direction of socialism in one country, but it also emphasized turning its attention to the colonized East in the hope of exploiting emerging economic problems. There was a revitalized propaganda assault against Zionism. In line with its new policy towards social democrats, the Comintern labeled Ben-Gurion's Mapai a social fascist party. The Histadrut became the Nazi Histadrut. And later on, Zionism and Nazism were accused of collaborating to produce a mass hysteria which would catalyze a mass immigration of Jews to Palestine. The killing of Jews by Arabs, mainly the anti-Zionist ultra-Orthodox who lived in unfortified exposed areas during the disturbances of 1929, became a test case for the new Comintern line. The killings recalled the terror of the Russian pogroms for many Palestinian Jews at that time. The Comintern saw things differently in Moscow. Georgy Safarov, the head of the Comintern's Eastern Department, understood the tales of massacres of Jews in Hebron and Safed only in terms of being undiluted imperialist propaganda. Other communist parties took its line from Moscow and portrayed the riots as an uprising of the Arab masses against British imperialism. Its anti-Jewish reflection was portrayed as a natural consequence. The Palestine Communist Party then put out a pamphlet entitled The Mufti, Matthias, and the Great Peasant Uprising 2,000 years ago. This drew a parallel between the Hanukkah story and the 1929 killings, with the Mufti's supporters playing the part of the Jewish rebels of Hasmonean times of the 2nd century BCE. The Jews had effectively established the Palestine Communist Party and thus were ditched by Moscow 10 years later in the hope of cultivating Arab nationalism. The Jews were allowed to advance in all the communist parties of the world, but were denied this in Palestine. Jews were subsequently purged from the PCP. Some were offered posts as assistants to the new Arab leaders. Many Jews left the Palestine Communist Party and joined Zionist parties. The leadership returned or was recalled to the USSR, only to perish in the Gulag several years later. Others left the country. In the United States, Jews left the Communist Party in protest. By 1924, the Comintern was placing greater emphasis on the defense of Soviet Russia and less openly on international revolution. Many foreign communists found it difficult to make a distinction. For most, the two were one and the same. Indeed, enlistment in the struggle for international socialism was followed in other ways. The recruitment of Kim Philby, the Soviet master spy, at Cambridge was carried out by the Czech Jewish communist Arnold Deutsch, whose cover was that of an Orthodox Jew. What about communist attitudes in Britain towards Zionism? The Communist Party of Great Britain was, in Lenin's eyes, one of the most important CPs. It could promote the anti-imperialist struggle from the heart of the empire. It could assist the Soviet Union in its struggle to survive by undermining Britain, the leading force in the array of anti-Soviet states. Lenin's dream attracted many from the colonies, and especially from the Indian subcontinent, those who hated British imperialism and wished to see an independent, free and socialist India. Like many British Jews, they found in the Communist Party a home free of racism and colonial paternalism. Indeed, it was the white workers of Battersea who elected Sapurji Saklawala, scion of the well-to-do Tatar family of Bombay, to Parliament as a Communist MP in 1927. Britain became the location where many of the empire's elite came to receive their education. Moshe Sharet, Israel's first foreign minister, studied at the LSE, while Jawaharlal Nehru went to Harrow and to Trinity College, Cambridge, and then studied law at the Inner Temple in London. Many forged contacts with the early Labour Party and after World War I with the embryonic Communist Party. Rajani Palm Dutt and his elder brother Clemens were the sons of a middle-class Indian doctor and a Swedish mother who had defiantly challenged the racial prejudice of late Victorian society. Palm Dutt was born into a privileged household, went to public school and to Oxford. During World War I, he opposed the conflict and was imprisoned for being a conscientious objector. Thus, the October Revolution and the triumph of Bolshevism had great meaning for him. He and his brother joined the newly founded Communist Party of Great Britain, and he was regarded as the foremost ideologist of the party for the next half-century. In 1921, he established his journal, Labour Monthly, almost certainly funded by the Comintern, and this became a vehicle to influence generations of the British left, regardless of whether or not they were affiliated to the Communist Party. Dutt, like many early communists, regarded the centrality and survival of the USSR as paramount. This sense of defending the USSR publicly allowed him never to dissent from the official view of the Kremlin. It became an article of faith, even within the internal discussions of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Dutt was the greatest defender of Stalin during his lifetime, and even in his twilight years was prepared to criticize any opposition to the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. He was regarded by the Kremlin as the safest pair of hands in Britain. In addition, Dutt genuinely believed that the USSR had solved the problem of national minorities, including that of the Jews. He could claim with some justification and with few exceptions that only British communists took an unequivocal stand for Indians, blacks, and other colonized peoples against the institutionalized racism of early 20th century Britain. Dutt was the party's foremost expert on India and on the colonial question. All members of the CPGB deferred to him. Dutt's view of Jewish nationalism was conditioned primarily by the vested interests of the Soviet Union. Zionism, moreover, was fitted into the conventional perception of anti-colonialism. It was examined in the context of the Indian struggle. It was seen as Eurocentric and sponsored by imperialism in the form of the British Mandate. Zionism was regarded as wrong and not as different. Marxist Zionist efforts in establishing the kibbutz collective and forging a command economy based on the Soviet model were glossed over. Jewish communists had no real place in Palestine except in arousing the Arab masses. However, the rise of Hitler to power in January 1933 and the threatening presence of Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists introduced a new ingredient into the Communist Party of Great Britain's approach. The party wanted a solid base within a working class community. The Jews offered this because they appreciated the communist principled stand against anti-Semitism and were deeply drawn to the idea of creating a better world. Like many Jews, they were attracted by the ideals of the October Revolution and the determination of the Bolsheviks to change the modus operandi of British society. For some, it offered the opportunity to escape their Jewishness. For others, to reaffirm it by fighting Hitler in Republican Spain and within the anti-fascist struggle in general. The CPGB in the mid-1930s offered the possibility of escaping anti-Jewish racism, embracing Anglicization, socializing with non-Jews, and gaining access to education and intellectual discussion. Many Jews regarded the Communist Party of Great Britain as the university which their impoverished parents were unable to send them to. The advent of Victor Golantz's Left Book Club in 1936 introduced many socialist writers and intellectuals, such as George Orwell, to Jewish members of the Communist Party. By 1936, the Comintern had decided upon a volte-face and embarked on a popular front strategy to confront the spread of fascism. Social Democrats were no longer social fascists. The Labour Party once more became touchable. The influx of Jews into the party created a situation whereby Jews were now disproportionately represented, and particularly in the party's hierarchy and leadership. Indeed, party membership trebled between 1930 and 1935. With the onset of the Arab Revolt in the spring of 1936, the Communist Party of Great Britain demanded a halt to Jewish emigration from Nazi Germany, cessation of land purchases, and a constitution for a legislative assembly. However, many Jewish members of the CPGB, while not identifying with Zionism per se, understood the attacks against Jews in Palestine in the context of attacks against Jews in Britain and in Europe generally. It raised the question of differentiating between Jewish national interests and the Comintern line. Why should attacks on Jews be fought in England and not in Palestine? The simple party line that the Arab and Jewish workers should fight Zionism, Arab feudalism, and British imperialism did not reflect the global reality as a number of Jewish communists understood it in 1936. The CPGB's fight against fascism and anti-Semitism thereby clashed with the Comintern's anti-Zionist policy. The CPGB's loyalty to the Comintern had to be squared with its interest in maintaining and expanding its political base within the Jewish community. The Peel Commission report in 1937, which advocated a two-state solution and a partition of Palestine, was rejected by the party. The party's line was that only a single Arab state shall exist in Palestine with full citizen rights for Jews. The Nazi-Soviet pact of August 1939 was a bombshell for all members of the Communist Party of Great Britain. For its Jewish members, it was a numbing experience, a challenge to their faith in the cause of revolution. Did Stalin sign to buy time? Was the annexation of the Baltic states and half of Poland a means to construct a buffer territory against a future German invasion? Did Stalin, on the other hand, believe that this conflict between imperialist rivals, Germany on one side, Britain and France on the other, would end in mutually assured destruction, such that the hitherto neutral USSR could then fulfill Lenin's dream by advancing into Western Europe and imposing communism? Large amounts of war materiel was shipped to Germany from the USSR, and according to the Matrokin archive, sabotage was conducted against British defence factories. There was much anti-British propaganda in the Soviet press during the Battle of Britain, and Stalin congratulated Hitler on entering Paris. In the midst of this swirling vortex with its annihilationist consequences, were Jews now expected to sacrifice themselves in the cause of the greater revolutionary good? Some Jewish members of the Communist Party of Great Britain in 1940, such as Erich Hobsbawm, went along with the party line and endorsed the Nazi-Soviet pact. Yet Hobsbawm did not know that there was a secret clause in the Nazi-Soviet pact whereby German communists who had sought refuge in the USSR would be handed back in exchange for Nazi Germany handing back Soviet agents. Indeed, on the 8th of February 1940, the NKVD led 30 German communists, including several Jews, across the bridge crossing the River Bug into the hands of the Gestapo. In the Labour Party rank and file and within the unions, there was a real anti-war sentiment, a stop-the-war sentiment. There was a deep fear of a repetition of the carnage of World War I, when ordinary people perished in their millions in a futile war between empires. The Communist Party's stand attracted the attention of many on the British left, when no one else was opposing the war between Britain and Nazi Germany. It is significant that the number of Communist Party of Great Britain members increased by over 30% with the onset of war. The circulation of the Daily Worker increased, and that of Labour Monthly trebled in the year after the outbreak of war. Yet the Communist Party of Great Britain had to perform political somersaults. In early September 1939, the party argued that a war against Hitler was indeed a just war. By early October 1939, this line had reversed itself 180 degrees when the Comintern instructed it to oppose it as a war between two groups of imperialist countries for world domination. The Poland of the colonels, it was argued, could easily be depicted as a semi-fascist country. Some leaders of the Communist Party of Great Britain could therefore justify their stand in that it would not be a terrible thing if Poland were to disappear from the map of Europe. The war also pitched Rajani Palmdutt against Harry Pollitt, the party's Secretary General. Indeed, Pollitt had originally published a pamphlet entitled How to Win the War, only for it to be replaced by Dutt's Why This War? Dutt inevitably followed the Comintern line in abandoning the Popular Front strategy and argued that this was another imperialist war, just as in World War I. In addition, this line of argument opened the way to the belief that there could be an understanding for national liberation movements in the developing world in approaching both Germany and Italy, that there was now no bar to working with the Nazis if it provided a method for ousting the British imperialists and securing independence. After all, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The former president of the Indian National Congress, Subhash Chandra Bose, arrived in Berlin in March 1941 because he believed that the Nazis could assist in removing the British from India. He opposed the non-violent strategy of Gandhi and enlisted German assistance in training an Indian military force which he believed would accompany a German attack on India once the USSR had been defeated. These Indian soldiers swore an oath to both Bose and to Hitler and fought British troops in Italy. If Italy's forces had been successful, in September 1940 and entered Cairo, they would have been welcomed as liberators by the Egyptians. Anwar Sadat, later the president of Egypt, wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Except for ill luck, we would have joined with the Axis, struck a quick blow at the British and perhaps won the war." Indeed, many leaders of national liberation movements in the Arab world, including the mainstream Palestinian one, spent the war years in Berlin. Had it not been for the victory at El Alamein, SS Obersturmbannführer Walter Rauff would have ordered his Einsatzkommando to liquidate the Jews of Palestine. Moreover, as in Eastern Europe, the Nazis expected local participation in their actions. There was, therefore, a profound difference of choice for Jews and for anti-colonial freedom fighters. In both cases, vested interest overcame other considerations. For the Jews, it was often a matter of life and death, an escape from systematic extermination. For many Jews, there was a difference between Comintern theory and policy and the reality in which European Jewry found itself. There was a precedent for this moral dilemma. In 1881, following the outbreak of a rash of pogroms in Tsarist Russia, revolutionary movements such as the Narodnaya Volya refused to condemn the mobs which slaughtered Jews. Its leadership surely opposed anti-Semitism, but it attempted to broaden the violence to focus instead on the authorities. Many of its Jewish members went along with this. Others left the revolutionary movement and reinvented themselves as the first Zionists. Trotsky himself had become sensitized to the prevalence and the use of anti-Semitism in the USSR when he lost the power struggle to Stalin and his supporters in the mid-1920s. Jews were depicted as being more involved in the left opposition than in either of Stalin's or Bukharin's factions. The use of anti-Semitic innuendo was initiated as a weapon to be used against highly assimilated Jews within the Bolshevik leadership, who had previously given little thought to their Jewishness. Bolshevik Jews, no matter how distant from their Jewishness, were not Russians, and therefore not qualified to lead Russia, not even a socialist Russia. Karl Radek, a strong supporter of Trotsky, who was expelled from the party, asked the question, what's the difference between Moses and Stalin? Moses took the Jews out of Egypt. Stalin takes them out of the Communist Party. In the 1930s, rising anti-Semitism in Europe caused Trotsky to revise his attitude that assimilation was the answer to the Jewish problem. Yet he related the problems of German Jewry to the belief that such difficulties could only be overcome by dispensing with the capitalist system. Trotsky had attempted throughout his life to rationalize human conduct and to insert reason into its deliberations. This governed his decision not to investigate his Jewishness. Yet throughout the 1930s, Trotsky became acutely aware of the Zionist answer to the Jewish problem. Trotsky had also taken to using the term Jewish nation and did not appear ideologically opposed to the Jews moving en masse to Palestine once the victory of socialism had been achieved. While Trotsky had predicted the Nazi-Soviet pact and powerfully condemned fascism, he also understood Stalin's rationale for keeping the USSR out of any conflict for as long as possible. Defending the Soviet Union, in his eyes, did not mean a rapprochement with the Kremlin bureaucracy. Moreover, he was pleased with Stalin's conquest of eastern Poland in 1939 and the incorporation of 16 million Poles into the Soviet Union, since its territory had now passed from private into public hands. Trotsky too saw the war as a continuation of World War I, a conflict between rival imperialisms. Trotsky reasoned that, quote, differences between decaying democracy and barbarian fascism disappear in the face of the collapse of the entire capitalist system. As victors, Britain and France would be no less fearful for the fate of mankind than Hitler and Mussolini. Supporting democracy over fascism would therefore be a lamentable lapse into social patriotism. At the end of the day, there was little to choose in 1940 between the views of the Stalinist ideologue Rajani Palm-Dutt and the sophisticated intellectual Leon Trotsky. This was the political dysfunction on the left which faced the Jews on the eve of their greatest tragedy. In the West, saving the Jews came to be seen as a consequence of winning the war. The question, what happens if there were no more Jews to save, was addressed only marginally. In the East, saving the Soviet Union and exporting the revolution was paramount. Moreover, the international proletariat did not rise up against their masters. The circle of abandonment of the Jews was complete. Soviet national interests ultimately trumped all other concerns, including the meaning of socialism. It can be argued that Stalin's desire to oust the British from the Middle East and to secure a Soviet presence there was a deciding factor in the Kremlin's espousal of a Jewish state in part of Palestine in the spring of 1947. Indeed, without Stalin's support, it is doubtful whether the UN would have voted by the mandatory two-thirds majority for a two-state solution in November 1947. It is doubtful that without Stalin, whether Israel would have come into existence in May 1948. Yet Soviet Jews who had applied to emigrate to Israel were quickly arrested and incarcerated for long years in the Gulag. The USSR's external policy in Palestine dovetailed with Zionist interests. Its internal policies did not. As Churchill remarked about the unpredictability of the Kremlin's policies, he said, "It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, but perhaps there is a key. That key is the Russian national interest." So, in conclusion, the road to utopia is paved with good intentions, but is accompanied by unexpected consequences. Today, the Soviet Union no longer exists, consumed by its own contradictions. Yet its legacy about Zionism lives on. These eras of history are carried on high while marching valiantly towards the new dawn of humanity. While the politics of virtue still attract, many Jews remain, as President Kennedy put it, idealists without illusions. It is this contradiction which both draws them near to and at the same time distances them from the British left. Yet this is no mere ideological dithering. 100 years ago, the Zionist philosopher Ahad Ha'am wrote, quote, "The Jew is both optimist and pessimist, but his pessimism has reference to the present, his optimism to the future." The road to utopia remains open. Everyone wishes to move forward, but the 20th century has taught that we do not all face in the same direction. Thank you.
It gives me very particular and personal satisfaction this evening to have the honour of trying to thank Professor Shindler for this magisterial talk. And this is not least because, in a sense, I owe myself a tiny pat on the back. In 1998, I managed to persuade Dr. Richard Stone and the Lord Ashdown Trust to finance a fellowship in Hebrew studies at SOAS. Colin was selected for this important post, and after some 7 years, as we've already heard, the school very wisely decided to turn the research fellowship into a lectureship. Since then, Colin's rise through the ranks has been absolutely meteoric, and I think almost certainly without precedent in the history of the school. He was a postdoctoral fellow from 1998 to 2005, a lecturer for just 1 year, 2005 to 2006. He became a reader in 2006 for 2 years, and then, as we have seen, he became a professor in 2008. I should say that Colin has done us, SOAS, and the Lord Ashdown Trust, more remotely, very proud indeed. Before I turn to his lecture, I'd like to say just a few further words about Colin. Since he's been at SOAS, he's really taken up the cause of Israeli studies. We'd been doing Jewish studies and Hebrew studies and Middle Eastern Jewish studies and all sorts of other things before, but he's taken up the cause of Israel studies. He's attracted huge classes. In one of his classes at the moment, I believe, he's got 72 students, which in SOAS terms is a lot of students. He's also recently been voted one of the best teachers in the school, and he received an award to that effect last year. He has an awesome publication record. In addition, he's taken over the running of the Center for Jewish Studies, which I established with the help of Professor Jeffrey Alderman, who is here this evening, and who was then the Pro-Vice-Chancellor of the University of London, and this was just about 20 years ago. His devotion and energy have contributed to making SOAS the great place it currently is. In Colin's talk, we've seen the difficulties encountered by the left in its view of Jews and Zionism over the last wretched century. A century in which totalitarians and utopians claimed title to the one single truth. Jews or Zionists were viewed as victims or oppressors according to the ideological needs of the one single truth of the moment. In 1944, the British Labour Party advocated that the Arabs be encouraged to move out of Palestine, as did the humanist philosopher Bertrand Russell, to make way for Zionist settlement. Sections of the left today in this country advocate the contrary position. Isaiah Berlin, who was quoted by Colin this evening in a very apposite way, has taught us that the very notion that there could be one final answer to organizing human society is a dangerous illusion that would lead to nothing but bloodshed. And in the 20th century, attempts to find that final answer, a good deal of the bloodshed was Jewish blood, a lot of it in the final solution. Colin has taught us this evening a hugely important lesson, and that lesson is that the modern history of the Jews is sui generis. It simply does not fit into the facile categories of the ideological structures, either of the detractors or sometimes even the supporters of Zionism. I've learned a great deal this evening, as I'm sure everybody here has, and I would like you to join with me in a moment in thanking Professor Shindler once again for a brilliant and controversial talk, which I think will give us food for thought for a very considerable time. But before I close, I would just like to inform you that there will be a reception, and in order to get to the reception, you have to go through this door and then up the stairs, and I think then it will be clear where the room is. It's on the left at the top of the stairs. So now I'd like you to join me in thanking Professor Shindler once again for an extraordinary talk.
Ze zijn maar gaaien, ben ik her. Du bist mein Ein und einst Gezatzke. Ich komme heim zu dir, das was du tutst von mir. Ja, no, I feel alright. In der Heim, als Dings ist so fein. In der Heim, lebendig freilich sein. Es gibt eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich hab gearbeitet wie ein Hund. Ich gebe eine schwere Tage, dicke Nacht. Ich darf schon schlafen, ganz gesund. Ich komme heim zu